Hello and welcome to a new video. Today I'll be talking about Necrophosis. This is not going to be a lore video, but more of a discussion and critique. Not having access to tons of Necrophosis clips in order to splice together, I shall instead recycle the Scorn clips that I used when talking about that game. Which I suppose is fitting considering the amount of time that Scorn is mentioned in discussions of Necrophosis. You see, Scorn is a game that is inspired by the works of H.R. Giger and Zdzisław Beksinski. Necrophosis, meanwhile, is inspired strictly by the latter. This does have consequence to the world building and design of the game. Giger started out actually studying architecture, which allowed him to figure out how even though when he's making fantastical machinery, there still has to be an element of believability in it. One has to be able to imagine that the various contraptions throughout Giger's worlds can work, and consequently the same for Scorn, which is why so much of it is very mechanical and industrial, even if it is metal overlapping flesh. Beksinski, meanwhile, was not as concerned with making his worlds realistic, but instead allowed them to be engulfed completely in ruinous fantasy. One doesn't really need to consider how things truly work in a Beksinskian environment, they just do, by magic. And while this strategy does absolve the devs of the standards that come with things in reality, it also runs a risk of them adding in things that are weird for the sake of being weird, something the Scorn devs attempted to avoid and I would argue mostly succeeded in. However, I think one of the biggest things separating Scorn and Necrophosis is simply how the gameplay is handled. Yes, they're both first-person games that allow you to look down and see your body, but Scorn is a game with enemies, combat, and losing conditions. The puzzles in the game also tend to be more standard puzzles from a video game just with a biomechanical paint job. Necrophosis, meanwhile, according to the devs, won't have any combat but will have chase sequences, with the additional interesting tidbit being that if you are caught, you would still be able to continue through the game, almost as if there's different endings depending on how well you play, though that's undetermined as of right now. The puzzles, meanwhile, are much simpler than even Scorn's. You find yourself in what's effectively a sandbox that you need to wander around in and collect items, and then figure out where those items go. So far, the puzzles haven't been any more complex than take a thing to a thing, and then you grab another thing and take it to a third thing. However, what's interesting is most of the puzzles are actually skippable. All you have to do is take brains to these three heads in order to progress further through the game. Everything else is completely optional, offering not so much lore as dark poetry as a reward for your additional efforts. However, perhaps oddest of all is that there's at least one thing in the demo that appears to be something that you can do and interact with that has no solution. These four campers here are huddled around barely burning wood, just wanting to experience a little bit of warmth in the end of the universe. However, as far as I can tell, there's literally nothing you can do to interact with their fire. And it's strange because not even that far away from them is this sort of temple cave with a bunch of lit candles, and you can't take it over to them. You can't help these guys. They're just stuck, wallowing in their misery. Now, if there's one thing in the game that I did like and took quick notice of, it's that every item has a description, and not just multitudes of different items, but multitudes of the same items. Even something as same-ish as these multitudes of eyes of a prophet all have a slightly different backstory. Because of this small detail, it makes it worthwhile checking your inventory from time to time for just a bit of tidbit, a little bit of information about the world and what the item even represents. Most games would give the same description for the eye of a prophet, unless it's very important that you know it's the eye of a separate prophet. Yet, all of those eyes go into the same creature. They all end up in the same place, and yet the devs still found the will and the need to differentiate them and their histories. It is additional effort that I have noticed and appreciate. There are, however, some peculiarities when it comes to the game and its world building. When you first leave the spawn area, you are greeted by this guy who starts reciting the Percy Shelley poem Ozymandias. The poem is about a traveler who comes across the ruins of a statue of an arrogant ruler who assumed that his empire would last forever. There's many ways that one could interpret such a poem being recited in a game like this that takes place at the end of time and space itself, the end of existence, among multitudes of giant humanoid and creature forms. It could very well be the old gods that evidently exist within this game's universe, as the game is also highly inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, who assume that by virtue of what they are, they would last forever. Hell, it could even be existence itself being arrogant. However, at the end of the demo, you see the two legs, or at least feet, described in Shelley's poem, as well as a giant frowning head described in the poem, meaning that guy might have been talking about something that literally existed. So is that Ozymandias? Is that called Ozymandias? And that's something that presumably is going to be expanded on and discussed further, something that is actually a part of the game in some way or another. When you walk by this giant angelic being, this spectral robe emerges, floats through the air, and starts reciting poetry. Among what it says is this:
"And with strange eons, even death may die."
Which is a very famous line from the works of H.P. Lovecraft. It's added in probably as a reference or in order to look clever, but it's also just a little bit superfluous because the rest of the text of everything else also reaffirms that everything is just dead and dying. There's really only so many ways that you can convey the fact that shit's totally fucked in text form before it gets a little bit irritating, and what I found by the end of the demo is that they've crossed that threshold. It simply seems to reaffirm the obvious without introducing anything truly new. I'm more interested in that angelic being that looked upon us with mercy or whatever, if we'll see it again or if it's just a one-off thing. But with how simplistic the rest of the game is, and how often they seem to be interested in referencing works by famous authors, it just comes off as a little bit pretentious. Scorn was also a fairly pretentious game. The subtitle for what was supposed to be the first part of the game was a German word associated with a relatively obscure German philosopher that I'm willing to bet most people never heard of. But there's an irony in trying to convey deep messages in flowery language because it just seems to end up looking like you're unable to convey your thoughts in simple terms, as if you don't even know what you're talking about yourself. Necrophosis is similar to that, but without the addition of a grounded technological world to provide even the illusion of being sensible. As I said before, in a purely Beksinskian setting like the one Necrophosis provides, the devs don't have to worry too much about everything making sense, but can fall into the pit of nothing making sense and nothing particularly mattering. The main goal when you leave the spawn point is finding 3 brains to put into heads of bodies as sticking out of a giant creature. This particular brain is very difficult to spot if you don't know where it's supposed to be initially. Important items that you can interact with when you get close to them do shimmer, but when you're running around trying to find the last brain, it is very easy to miss that one on the ground. And if you inadvertently get too close to the wallowing figure, his animation will play out and end, and he'll be just one more body amongst the multitudes of corpses littering the environment. That, thankfully, is the only real problematic item I've come across, though I haven't really come across that many items in that many places in the relatively short demo. But it is somewhat concerning if that will come up again at some point in the future. Another thing that I also found to be a bit bothersome was the very liberal use of invisible walls, some being incredibly arbitrary. Like, my character is unable to jump. He is not getting over these rocks and barriers even if he wanted to without the invisible wall. In some ways, it comes off as if they built the environment and then just haphazardly plopped down some invisible walls regardless of if it's overlapping with something in the environment, of which it does quite frequently. I get not wanting the player to be able to roam around without limits, but there are better ways of removing the player's ability to go forward even further. Hell, the fact that your player can't jump does that for you. Removing access to the Z-axis does a number on the player's ability to bumblefuck around beyond where the devs want him to be if there's a barrier he can't possibly step over. It should be noted that the game quite literally does this with the stairs next to that angelic being. So the devs do know that's a thing they can do, and also that becomes an area that looks pretty but seems very pointless unless there's something expanded upon it in the final release. Also, when heading back from visiting the earlier area after unlocking the gate, this goofiness happened. It's like the good old days in the Scorn demo, getting stuck in that one area in the lower levels. And I guess that's all I really have to say. The visuals are striking, but the gameplay is so-and-so, and the lore or world building is hit and miss as far as I've seen. Also, this guy here looks like a fucking walljack. He looks like his wife's boyfriend gave him an extra hour of playtime on the Switch. I hope we see him again. He's a funny little guy. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the video, that gave you something to think about and otherwise entertained you. Take care.